welcome back, everybody. Our goal for today's conversation is more or less to start off where we left at the dual power conversation. Now, we had this very broad strokes conversation about a general theory of change based around this idea of building a new society within the shell of the old, building forms of solidarity, cooperation, and self-governance at the grassroots, local, community level, slowly accumulating power over time until somehow we transform society on a large scale. Today, what we want to do is to dig deeper, basically into this question of who will make the revolution? Who is actually responsible for making revolutionary transformation happen? And that is a messy conversation. We know it's a messy conversation. It's always been a messy conversation. But it's our hope that in challenging ourselves and each other to really take serious these questions of organization and leadership, that we can together find answers, find paths to move forward, past some places where, frankly, right now, we see many movements feeling stuck in a place where we're kind of oscillating between these historically stuck paradigms of how we should organize ourselves, what leadership even is, for example. And before we get into sort of historical examples, into the politics of communalism, into the examples of the ongoing Kurdish freedom movement and how they've made an attempt to kind of step beyond the preset boxes that we think are holding us back, we want to actually just ground the conversation in some terminology and see what we're all bringing with us into the room already. And that starts by just simply asking, Mason, if you're willing to describe a bit, what is leadership? So the question we want to ask the audience is, what comes to mind when you hear the word leadership? And I want to invite everybody to think about not just the positive or the negative, but a little bit of both, whatever comes up to mind based on your experience, your perspective. What comes to mind when you hear the word leadership?
Well, modeling values.
Modeling values. Okay. In the back? Listening.
Like catalyzing the potential of others committed to doing that and capable of doing that.
Catalyzing potential.
Taking responsibility, not externalizing it.
Taking responsibility instead of externalizing it. Hands I missed in the middle on our way left. Facilitating a space. You're going to say that. Nat? Empty corporate buzzword, yeah. Like I said, let's dig into whatever connotations you may have experience with. Yes?
Military commanders.
Military commanders, that is certainly a form of leadership. In the back?
Domineering.
Domineering, also a form of leadership. Intentionality, yes, we're getting messy. I like it.
Unjustified authority.
Unjustified authority, we've seen that happen, yes?
Charismatic, ego-driven person.
Charismatic, ego-driven people.
Decision making.
Decision making, yeah, did I see you?
Zoom, people are saying a leader is someone who has followers. At its worst, white men telling everyone else what to do. At its best, community member able to hold space and facilitation.
At its worst, white men telling everybody what to do. At its best, community members holding space and facilitating. I'm paraphrasing. One more. Delegating. Okay.
Can I have one?
Sure.
I'd say holding the overarching vision, like knowing all the components of what you need, where of the direction it goes.
Holding the overarching vision and all the different components of where we are going together. This is all great, and they're all the right answer, right? Leadership is not a word that is so bright. Leadership is not a word that we own that has one definition. Just to kind of spoiler alert, jump ahead. We believe it's important to see different forms of leadership, and that our movement is going to have to find a way to define and embody and put into practice liberatory forms of leadership that get us what we need out of somebody taking initiative and responsibility without all the baggage of the domination. But that is not an easy task, and it's an age-old question that movements have been discussing with them since there was a left, and even before. But I think we could also use even more grounding, right? So we've just heard some first impressions of what comes to mind when we hear the word leadership, we think about the concept of leadership. We've heard both the good and the bad, but we actually want to start off by encouraging us to talk to each other in pairs about some actual experiences we have had in our own lives with different forms of leadership. So as simply and efficiently as possible, we'll ask you to pair off and take 5 minutes to answer the first question, then we'll switch to the second question. And we'll kind of come back and see what we came up with. The first question is, when was a time when you experienced a form of leadership that was harmful to your organizing project? It could also, doesn't need to be activist organizing. It could be in a workplace. It could be in a community. But when is a time you experienced a harmful form of leadership? Pair off. We'll check in 5 minutes. Make sure you have time to hear from each other. We're not going into all the details of he said, she said, but just the broad strokes of what happened. All right, thanks, y'all. I know we're like getting you started on a very engaging question and then stopping you right when the wheels start turning. But we got a lot of ground to cover. The next question is, when was a time when you experienced a lack of leadership as being harmful to your organizing project? Or again, in your community, right? In your workplace, et cetera, et cetera. When was a lack of leadership? We're focusing on the negative here because we're trying to identify a real problem. We're trying to identify what's holding us back. So same structure, we're gonna take 5 minutes, half and half, each side of the partnership. When was a time when a lack of leadership harmed your organizing project or your community, held you back? Go for it. So I hope you all had some great conversations. I hope it was messy. Before we move on, I want to draw some of this out to share with the wider room. So we're just going to do a little bit of popcorning about the answers you heard or had to both questions. And I want to encourage us to not get caught up in all the nitty-gritty details. Literally see if you can distill this in 2 or 3 sentences, just as another example of a particular kind of experience with leadership. So first of all, popcorning, the first question, what was the experience when leadership caused harm or a harmful form of leadership?
Can I start with this side? And if you're over here, step forward by that table so we can avert our feedback situation with that speaker.
Oh,
Anyone?
we're using the mic, okay.
Yeah. Anyone from right here?
We said like the workplace, undemocratic bosses and managers.
I'm thinking about what Kim shared of holding the overarching vision. Bosses who are constantly changing what the game plan is to chase funding.
Yeah, me and the comrade back there were talking about bosses or coaches that are telling people how to do the work that they have no idea how to do properly.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, we were talking about a situation where leadership was actually explicitly shared, but there was no real willingness to align those people, so we were stuck on a treadmill of starting project after project without getting clear on an overarching strategy.
Is this just for this section or also? Okay, so like, yeah, we did, our leader kind of did after burnout. Basically, there was too much roles assigned to our leader, and he took on too much roles willingly, and then it was just this kind of passive, okay, tell me what to do type of thing, and it just basically burned out that way.
I think that's a really interesting example because it's sort of both of these at once. Leadership that is too holding too much in itself, leading to a situation of lack of leadership. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
I'm fine. We talked about when people don't own their needs and desires. So even as simple as a restaurant, no one says what they want to eat, so we don't eat. No leadership in that way.
We were talking about how sometimes identity politics are weaponized to save optics against people who want to make structural change for the better.
I was in a situation where I was sort of a middle manager in a corporate company and received this role with very little structure attached to it and was working very hard to try to create some structure around it. Was blamed for a decrease in sales because I'm an anti-capitalist, so of course I would sabotage it. But what resulted in it was not only an incredibly abusive situation for myself, but then I was abruptly, I was fired / quit, unclear which. And what happened was that because I was in the middle of trying to create all of this structure, including writing myself a job description, it also left my team, who was left hanging with a lot of mess afterwards. So like just seeing the way it like messed up succession things too.
Maybe one more, then we'll do a transition here. And I promise we're gonna have more collective conversation. You're right up front. Denied.
Oh no.
Brutal.
Frick. Is this working? Okay, yeah.
We'll get you.
Yeah, just quickly, the arbitrary authority, like being a problem of like the information, like the people doing the work know what is working in the workplace, and the people who are just managing it from afar, like getting to make arbitrary decisions over like what is happening is really disheartening, because then you're like being micromanaged in like a direction that is like not helpful, but you have no say in like the quality of the work you're doing or like how that looks.
Right. Totally. And let's give Neil 15 seconds of fame.
I was just going to say controlling abusive narcissists who are like super insecure and violate your boundaries constantly.
Abusive narcissists who are insecure and violate the boundaries of others. Yes. Okay, so we've seen a vibrant picture painted here. If leadership is simply defined as, at least in relative terms, some kind of outsized amount of power and or influence in a particular individual, a particular organization, right? We've seen so many examples of how harmful that can be, especially for those of us who aspire to build liberatory future. At the same time, leadership can look like something else too, right? So what did we experience as the harmful effects of a lack of leadership, a distinct lack of leadership producing its own harms? Going back around, starting in the middle. Do you want to still do this left to right, Mason?
You just pass straight back.
Cool.
You three.
Thanks, y'all.
Shortstop. We were talking about how we both were experienced an organization where leadership was abdicated to the collective, and then there was this sort of, like, there were people who were kind of stepping in to do leadership-like things, but then the group would sort of like cut that, or be like, well, that decision wasn't made by the group, and there wasn't this match between like, well, we're supposed to hold like leadership collectively, but that didn't come with more people becoming in the responsibilities of making the group leaderful.
Yes,
Right.
very similarly. Without strong facilitation in a space, it can devolve quickly into chaos, or some particular voices just dominating the space.
The tyranny of structurelessness, you say, for all you nerds.
We talked about like a situation where a lot of people were prepared to lead and had a lot of leadership skills and tactics, but nobody was initiating it. And it was in a moment of rapid response. So it just kind of came down to like, who's going to make the call?
Right. The capacity's there, but nobody's willing to step forward. Wow. Yeah.
I think mine's a flavor of Anthony's, but convening a space where there's not enough coherence yet with the intention of being like participatory and then stepping out of the leadership, but the group doesn't have the coherence to like maintain itself and continue on, and a lot of momentum is lost.
That one hurts, Nicole.
Yeah, in my experience, a lack of leadership that harmed a collective project was just like no accountability or responsibility to carry forward difficult processes, like a conflict internally, or like holding a team accountable to a priority they set but then didn't do or decided to change. So kind of accountability, lack of accountability and responsibility.
Yeah.
Any from this side?
See Nat in the back?
It struck me that in one of the stories I was hearing, both of these were kind of flip sides of the same situation of an organization where a 501c3 they were working with had, was holding the purse strings, and so the like stifling experience of trying to actually access their money and having to deal with like whatever petty bullshit that organization wanted to hold over them. But then when they got the money, there not being enough, it seems like clarity or intentionality around how to spend it.
Yeah.
Maybe
A couple more?
you two, and
Then we can move on.
I feel like we've both been the person and experienced people where it's like they're either sort of pushed into leadership by others, especially like young folks, or step into leadership but have no mentorship, straight training, self-development. And I feel like it's like leadership as a noun of like this person is our leadership versus like as an actual way of being that you've been trained in.
I love how you put that.
Related to Anthony's share earlier, that was also a connection between these two things, because the person abdicated because they were perceived as holding leadership poorly. So they sort of got pitchforked out of the role, and there was nothing else to hold it.
Right. Right, so again, we're painting a vibrant picture on the other side. Leadership is not one thing, right? A boss, a landlord, a dictator, a patriarchal father, what the Kurdish movement considers the original proto-state. These are all forms of leadership, you could say, if we're just talking about an outsized amount of power and influence, right? But in our lives, we've probably all had that teacher, that mentor, that sports coach, that community member we could rely on, that visionary whose ideas inspired us to challenge ourselves, gave us a sense of clarity we didn't otherwise have about how to move through the world. Those are also leaders. That's also a form of leadership. So leadership, right, it could be something that's dominating, that's disempowering. It can also be something that's empowering. So, right, some leadership can be an obstacle to self-governance, right? We're moving towards talking about the politics of communalism here. And some forms of leadership can be a catalyst for self-governance. And that's what we want to try to kind of tease out here. So this exercise was intended to kind of name the tension in the room between these different forms of leadership, and to recognize that that tension produces a set of problems inherent to the process of building transformative change that any revolutionary movement has to find a way to wrestle with. In order to wrestle with them, we have to name them, and that's what Mason's going to do right now. At least some of them.
Well, a number of these things that we've talked about have actually emerged organically in our conversations throughout the week. There's very little that I'm going to share here that we have not already discussed together. The first has been this theme that just having a process of democracy does not itself result necessarily in a liberatory politics. We live in a society of, let's say generously, very mixed levels of political development and political consciousness. And this question of how we build a free society through democratic forms in a society when most people do not have liberatory worldviews is one of these, not just challenges, but dilemmas of emancipatory politics in our context. Each of these things that we're going to talk about are challenges to overcome, but they are also inherent, built-in tensions to the nature of the kind of project that we are pursuing. And we need to think of them as these dilemmas or tensions that there isn't a obvious solution to. There's something to navigate. The second that I want to talk about that has to do with the relationship between leadership and the broader social body of ordinary people in society, which is we don't simply have democratic participation or participatory forms by default. Somebody, somewhere, at some time, needs to take the initiative to ensure that those come together, that people are organized into spaces where they can make decisions together. Who are those somebodies? This is a real political question for our movement. Is it us? Is it someone else that we imagine out there? And then, even more challengingly, how do they then relate to those processes of democracy? Are they in charge? Something else? Are they just a ordinary participant in that process? These are really thorny and challenging strategic questions that have to do with our role in the broader process of transforming society. The third is a question of the culture of the political spaces that we create. And I think we need to face squarely the fact that our politics, especially in a country like this one, are extraordinarily fringe. We lie on the edges of society at large as political consciousness. And I have been a part of and seen any number of political experiments that have had very high aspirations for what that organization or project was to do. The classic example is a bunch of social ecology radicals get together, there's a moment of crisis, and we say, now is the time to call an assembly. Let's get everyone out. We're gonna do direct democracy, and then we're gonna try to federate with other neighborhoods, scale this shit until we have a radical democratic structure from below. The challenge is that we are, in many ways, distinct from, separate from that wider social body that we would like to bring into the assembly process. The very fact that each of you are in this room discussing big questions like this is something that makes you different from your other neighbors, your other coworkers. And we have to have consciousness of that difference, because when we craft political spaces and institutions that draw us, that appeal to us, there are real limitations on its ability to absorb other sorts of people who have, who represent the whole diverse fabric of social life. I've touched on this already, but I think this fourth bullet is the fundamental challenge that we are trying to think through how to overcome. This is often referred to as the problem of the militant minority. How do you navigate the problem that the people who most want to empower all of society, or all of the working class, or any other open-ended large body of people, are a tiny minority even of that broader social group? This produces a whole range of other debates and discussions within the movement. Do we build a revolutionary party? Do we engage in prefigurative politics? Do we attempt to seize state power on behalf of the people as a sort of minority group to impose a new vision? All of these are different attempts at answering this problem. How is it possible for a sliver of society to empower the whole of society when that whole of society doesn't necessarily want it, or isn't prepared to take it for itself, or has been, as Öcalan has been saying, has been domesticated into being unwilling to take it for itself? We have mostly avoided the isms conversation this week, which is interesting. That's not how all ISE intensives go. There was a little bit of discussion of it in the very first session, only as some historical context for where social ecology comes from. And I don't want to bog us down here. We're going to talk briefly about some seeming binaries in political logic on the revolutionary left, only to illustrate what are the ways in which the debates and discussions we've been having up to this point have been caged in a set of concepts that are possibly not that useful for us. We're going to name this in order to break out of it and have a more creative and interesting discussion about what's politically possible. So, the revolutionary left, at least since the 1860s, has been primarily split between these two poles of the Marxists and the anarchists, who have very similar aims, wanting to achieve a stateless, classless society, but think of methods and the process of transition in very different terms. They didn't start out as having these radically different perspectives. And in fact, much of the ideas that we later became understood as anarchism, as a sort of political orthodoxy, were created in reaction to, response to the flip side of that debate, and vice versa. Today, we see this playing out in a whole number of unhelpful and unproductive ways. I don't know how much you all watch anarchists and Marxist-Leninists fighting it out on Twitter. I do way too much of it for my own sanity and
don't recommend it.
Use of time. But there's lots of people who have become in our movement, who are like our fellow travelers, the people that we should be building with, who nevertheless have been sucked into a marsh where their own political identity and sense of self is tied to an ideological marker that shrinks their ability to think creatively in response to some of these dilemmas that we've shared. And part of why we're presenting these as inherent tensions, as real dilemmas to navigate, is to prompt us to think about how they don't have simple and straightforward solutions. And in fact, that the solutions that do exist are going to be moving targets. There's a push and pull between these tensions of power from below and the catalytic leadership role of the militant minority. And we need to think of it in these more dynamic and shifting terms. So for this problem of the militant minority, how do we get from here to there in terms of building a revolutionary movement? These two traditions of Marxism and anarchism have produced many different potential answers. I'm going to share two of them that are pretty far on the edges of that spectrum, but I think illustrate some of the dynamics that we have to wrestle with. The first I'm going to share is from a guy we all know named Lenin, who is in this, for the last century, it's been thought of as the strategic organizational thinker for those serious about carrying out revolution, at least if you were coming from a Marxist background, or even the fact that his movement had been successful was central in bringing so many disparate elements to a Marxist or Leninist perspective. His solution to the problem of the revolutionary minority, the militant minority, is a very simple and straightforward one. And I think there's lots of people from the anarchist tradition who adopt a kind of original sin mentality towards this answer. That because some communists thought up this idea, it condemned the whole 20th century to totalitarianism and political disaster in the name of socialism. And I think that's a mistake, because regardless of the insights and interventions of one particular person named Lenin 120 odd years ago, this problem would still have been present. As a friend of ours often jokes, if Lenin did not exist, somebody would have had to invent him, because that problem is one that we're facing across the board. So his answer was that we must focus revolutionary organization upon the militant minority. That the function of revolutionary organization is to draw and cohere the militant minority together into a revolutionary party, that being a political organization that has a program. And because that organization has a clear understanding of the problem in society and how to overcome it, it can act on behalf of those, the broader society or the broader class of workers who are not themselves politically conscious enough to transform society on their own. And in the Trotskyist and Leninist vernacular, this is sometimes referred to as substitutionism, that the party is able to substitute itself politically, put itself in place of, as a political agent, the class or the society. I also think that we need to wrestle with Lenin's answer to this question seriously, with for lack of a better word, some respect for where this is coming from, precisely because when I talk to ex-anarchists, anarchists who have been won over to the Maoist tradition or the Leninist tradition, it is precisely because their political tradition, they found, could not give them a persuasive enough answer for how to navigate this. So I think it is, particularly for those of us who are coming from an anti-statist revolutionary background, we have to shoulder the responsibility of coming up with a more persuasive, or at least an equally viable solution to this problem. Yes?
I'm not a scholar of these things. Can you just sort of summarize really quickly what the problem and what Lenin's answer was? Because I still am not getting it.
Yeah. Thank you for pausing me here.
Can you restate the question?
Yes, she's asking, can I re-articulate what actually is the problem of the militant minority, and what is Lenin's solution, how does it respond to it? Let's think of it in terms of our politics, of direct democracy and people's assemblies. We have a society today in which the vast majority of people, although they would describe themselves as being, at least in this country, describe themselves as being in favor of this thing that we call democracy, and they also may hate and despise the actual politicians elected by said democracy. But it is a vanishingly small number of those people who seriously believe that groups of neighbors getting together block by block should actually be the basis of government. This is the challenge where we want to empower millions of ordinary people who are not prepared to shoulder power for themselves. In the situation of the Russian Revolution and Lenin's interventions here, I think I'll circle us back to the Soviets and the rise of this dual power. And we gave a more simplistic picture of this on Sunday when talking about dual power, that like you have all these workers and soldiers building this new government from below that can then contest for authority with the official state. But in reality, many, if not most, of the regular people participating in those structures of bottom-up democracy did not believe that their purpose was to overthrow the provisional government. They wanted to have some kind of partnership or hold its feet to the fire to ensure that there was a transition to democracy, or they believed, or they were under the influence of political organizations that believed that a transition to socialism would take generations after this democratic revolution to ever be possible. And so the quandary that he was trying to navigate is, what does it mean, or how would one even begin to go about seizing power on behalf of people who do not believe they are ready to hold power? So, is that helpful? Okay. Thank you for pausing. Going to talk about another figure from the anarchist tradition who has an opposite, but I think parallelly compelling solution to the problem of the militant minority. And this is the late, great anarchist anthropologist David Graeber, central figure in the anti-globalization and Occupy movements. And what he always said was that he believed it was far more important that people and organizations act or operate in an anarchist manner than they be or think of themselves as anarchists. And so the way that he envisioned we could navigate this is anarchists participate in these movements that are underway and try to bring forward anarchist ways of doing things. So not everyone who shows up at the Occupy encampment in 2011 comes in believing in direct democracy. But the way that the encampment is run is through the General Assembly, in which people experience the process of a horizontal form of social organization. Yes?
I don't know if this is what you're going to get to. I don't know if this is what you're going to get to, but I'm just curious about your perspective on the idea that there need to be both. That there need to be people pushing forward anarchist strategies and tactics because that's a horizontalizing effect, and there should be just kind of a positive ripple effect from that, and that at the same time there is not a inherently negative effect to a revolutionary minority or like a vanguard party, and if those can coexist.
So presentation's over. You just made it. Thank you, then. So,
I have a quick clarifying question.
yes.
When we say that it is more important that they act anarchist than they be anarchist, that means that they identify as
Yes, yes, as they think of themselves as would probably be a better way to word this. And of course, quoting Kali Akuno, David Cobb articulated exactly this idea on Sunday, that it's easier to act your way into new ways of thinking than to think your way into new ways of acting. And I think this is a beautiful sentiment. It's an important corrective to have in our minds for those of us who get sucked into ideology world and getting fixated on our political concepts to the detriment of our practice. However, I want to also sprinkle in some problems, some challenges that have to do with this way of thinking. So, when David Graeber is talking about this, he's thinking about the Occupy Wall Street movement in particular, or that was like the best example that the anarchist movement had produced towards that end. At the same time, the same wave of revolutionary action all around the world, this movement that we call, this meta movement that we call the movement of the squares that exploded in 2010. Very similar things were underway. You know, in the UK, we also had the student movement that had decided, screw the political parties, we're going to engage in these horizontal, bottom-up forms of organization to win the world that we need. The same thing was underway in Spain through what was called Los Indignados, as their equivalent of the Occupy Wall Street movement that was focused on debt and financialization and all of these problems that were kind of front and center in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. And while I'm sure millions of people had transformative experiences out of those movements, the reality is that the new phase of struggle that took the baton from each of those movements was organized on radically different terms. Occupy Wall Street gave us what in this country? Bernie Sanders. The whole energy around a new discourse of income inequality made his campaign possible. And so we have a grassroots, bottom-up, for whatever each of these is own virtues and contributions to the struggle, what actually happened from people operating in an anarchist manner is a movement to win state power via this vehicle of a charismatic figurehead. Exact same thing happened to this bottom-up movement in the UK. You know, this is the origin point of the Jeremy Corbyn campaign, out of which these energies could be redirected into a fundamentally different kind of political strategy that could speak to the same underlying values. And in Spain, Los Indignados, this is the origin of the Podemos party experiment that was able to be fairly successful in elections throughout the 2010s. And so I think we have to wrestle with the fact that the ways our actions, our ways of experiencing political moments imprint themselves on our consciousness can be more superficial than it might appear in the immediate aftermath. And so an illustration of this from my organizing experience is that for years and years, Katie and I organized a block club in Detroit with neighbors, kind of this radically super local grassroots organization of neighbors that has a long tradition in the city. Most of them have a traditional top-down nonprofit structure of president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, blah, blah, blah. We did ours as kind of a assembly structure. And while people got a lot out of it and got engaged with what we were doing, when it came to merge with another block club in the same period where Katie and I were leaving, it reverted back precisely to the dominant form of grassroots organization. The dilemmas that we're wrestling with are ones that a whole swath of different creative solutions from across the revolutionary spectrum have been generated. And so we're going to tell a little bit of a story of some political movements that came from very different places, but ended up converging towards a very similar way of navigating this problem. So I'm going to tell a little bit about the anarchist side of this story. Arthur's going to tell a bit about the Marxist-Leninist side of this story. And then we're going to transition to what we think. So after the Russian Revolution, there was a real challenge faced by Russian anarchists, or anarchists who lived within the Russian Empire. Because, of course, the Russian Revolution had included many tens of thousands of anarchist militants who played key roles in different stages of it. And they had just gotten their butts kicked, even though the basic, like the central ideas of that revolution, democracy from below, of freedom from the central government, of workers in control of factories and peasants in control of the land, that was their program, and yet they were totally routed and defeated as the Civil War came to an end, and the USSR solidified as a party dictatorship under the Communist Party. So lots of anarchists were having discussions, the aftermath of this, some of whom had been survivors of the anarchist struggle in Ukraine. One of these was a peasant by the name of Nestor Makhno, and he had waged guerrilla war against the Red Army and the White Army simultaneously in this push and pull. And they wrote together this document after the revolution that's known as the Organizational Platform of the Libertarian Communists, which essentially argued that if anarchists are going to win, we need to have something that looks a lot like a political party, an organization that holds its members to a disciplined level of commitment, a shared political program, and a willingness to accept discipline and forms of even vertical structure within our organization to be able to carry out that program. Otherwise, we're just going to get our asses beat by the Bolsheviks and their followers again and again. A number of people, it was co-written, but some of the primary authors are someone named Peter Arshinov, Ida Met, and Nestor Makhno. These are all Russian and Ukrainian anarchists. The Libertarian Communists. Yeah. Now, most of the anarchist movement rejected this outright. They were like, you are trying to Bolshevize anarchism. You're trying to slip in these Marxist politics through the back door, through this called a necessity. But there were some who listened. And in fact, we talked earlier about the Spanish Civil War, and a number of the anarchist militants who were part of the anarcho-syndicalist movement there had conversations with these authors of the platform before they died that had real impacts on their political thinking. And of course, the Civil War ends very badly. They are defeated, and from that period, like this is usually treated as the end of classical anarchism around the world. There's a dark age in anarchist thought between this war and the 1960s. And most of the anarchists in the West who are rediscovering anarchism in the 60s have no relationship between to those generations of strugglers previously. They're kind of making it up anew, having read scattered pieces of it. But there's one place in the world where that isn't true, and that's Latin America, specifically the southern cone of Latin America, where some of these survivors of the anarchist movement in Spain fled to escape fascism. And they brought with them ideas of organizational discipline and commitment and a notion of the role of the political organization in relation to the working class, as we're not trying to create a single organization that does everything, but one that plays this catalyzing role by the organized militant minority in relation to the broader community of workers. And over the course of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, anarchists, particularly from Uruguay, but also Argentina and Brazil, developed these ideas into a new model that they call especificismo, which in essence, the specific of especificismo is the idea that in addition to these popular organizations of all the workers together in a union, all the community members together in a neighborhood assembly, we also need what they call ideologically specific or specific anarchist organizations. There's organizations that are unified theoretically, politically, who can then make interventions. It's socially insert themselves into these wider struggles to catalyze them. And while they don't use the language of party to describe what those organizations are, or they usually don't, I think in effect that is actually what they are. These are revolutionary political parties that have a vision of the role that they're playing that's different from trying to take power for themselves. And lastly, I'm just going to touch briefly on social ecology's journey with this question. Social ecology, although we talked about some of its Marxist roots, for the most part, through most of the history of social ecology, it's been thought of as an anarchist ideology. Like this is a vision for anarchism that is ecological and oriented towards direct democracy. But in the 1990s, Murray Bookchin and other anarchists, other social ecologists became disillusioned with the direction that anarchism was taking. This is in the triumphal point of individualism in this country following the fall of the Soviet Union, the Reagan years, all-time highs of fuck you dad energy in all sectors of society. And the anarchist movement became primarily defined by a sort of self-expressive orientation that Bookchin referred to as lifestyle anarchism. These are people who want to act out rebellion more so than transform society. And so he began developing re-articulating his politics of revolutionary democracy, which is what he called communalism, which is not oriented towards the complete emancipation of the individual self from all external constraints, but the positive creation of grassroots direct democracy as the political center of society. And interestingly, during this period of his life, Bookchin also looked back to the Marxist movements that he'd been a part of in his youth and wrestled with some of the babies that have been thrown out with the bathwater in his turn to anarchism. He was fond of asking people, particularly from like an anarchist perspective in this late period, what they thought of the term avant-garde. It's like those at the cutting edge, particularly in artistic movements. And the reception of this term is usually positive for those who think of themselves as countercultural and so forth. The word avant-garde is just French for vanguard. It's the same word. It means the same thing. And so in this late phase of Bookchin's political development, tried to start to reclaim the concept of a revolutionary vanguard and a vanguard organization that thinks of its relationship to the broader society in different terms from the Leninist one. It's not whether or not we have vanguard organizations, but to what purpose they are directed, and is to catalyze and empower and inject revolutionary ideas rather than to attempt to take power on their own behalf. And I'll send to you to talk about the other direction of this.
Yeah, so Mason has painted a picture of parts of the anarchist tradition that have seriously tried to wrestle with this question, what is the role of the militant minority, and how do you make a revolution in a society where most people are not revolutionaries? And we also have, I think, there's certainly more than this, but two particularly powerful and fortunately recent examples of movements that came out of the Marxist-Leninist tradition and went through their own period of transformation from the other direction, right? So when it comes to that question I just named about the militant minority, both of these movements had taken Lenin's answer for granted, right? That how do we make a revolution in a society where most people are not revolutionaries? A hardened core of committed, trained, disciplined revolutionaries would organize themselves into a disciplined party and make the revolution for the people, on behalf of the people, right? Mason used this word substitutionism. But both of these movements I'm about to tell a story of, through practice, realized the constraints they were placing on themselves by substituting leadership itself for the community, for society. Substituting the vanguard, if you will, or the party, if you will, for the society itself. And the first example is the Zapatista movement. And I'm not going to talk very much about that because Kiki did an incredible job earlier in the week. Most of you were there, about very rich history of the development of the Zapatista movement. But for those of you who don't remember, right, this is essentially a small group of Marxist-Leninist students from Mexico City who come down to southern Mexico into the jungles of the Lacandan jungle of southern Chiapas. And in the process of bringing their revolutionary ideas to existing indigenous communities that carried with them very egalitarian and democratic collective practices that had their own lineage, kind of through the process of shared struggle came to some kind of synthesis, right? And, for me personally, the first time I went to Chiapas to do solidarity work with the Zapatista movement, I brought with me a set of assumptions. At that time, I was hanging on very closely, very tightly, very proudly to that black flag of anarchism. And I felt, and I assumed, and I also had heard many stories that more or less painted the Zapatista movement as a movement that was just anarchist but used a different word, right? And the Zapatistas themselves have pushed back about this at different times in history, say, no, we're not anarchists, we're Zapatista. We have our own lineage, we have our own practice, right? And it is so true, crucially, that this movement, as Kiki taught you all, has built these bottom-up forms of democratic autonomy where decisions are made at the base, right, from below, by communities themselves and federated upward. But it would certainly be a mistake to see the Zapatista movement as a movement without leadership, right? Even Subcomandante Marcos, who famously or infamously, depending on who you are, wrote an essay called, and quote, "I shit on all the revolutionary vanguards of this planet." The man who wrote that essay was a general commander of an indigenous insurgent army. Okay, so we can, again, the word vanguard, do we use it? Do we use something else, right? That's not what's important here. But we have to wrestle with this question of leadership. It's there whether we acknowledge it or not. The question is how to give it a liberatory form and function, right? And the Zapatistas are one example of a movement that creates its own very beautiful, very messy, because it's real, synthesis in practice and in theory. And the other example I'll bring up, big surprise, is the Kurdish freedom movement, right? So many of us know that the Kurdish freedom movement that we've heard of today, the movement that led the revolution in northeast Syria, the Rojava revolution, really takes its influence going back to the formation of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK. This was a traditional Marxist, Leninist, very much Maoist in practice, vanguard organization. Its goal was to create a united socialist Kurdish state. Its means was to seize power through armed struggle and guerrilla warfare, and its vehicle for doing that was its interpretation of Lenin's vision of the disciplined party organization, right? Much like the Zapatistas, through the real existing living practice of struggle and reflection, the Kurdish movement went through its own period of transformation. Denise, the other day, did a beautiful job describing that transition, so I won't go over it in detail. But I want to dig into some key points of this transformation from what they call now in the movement the old paradigm to the new paradigm. And that's where we get the title of today's talk. The old paradigm is what we just described. But after Abdullah Öcalan, the founding leader of the Kurdish freedom movement, was imprisoned in Turkey and underwent that period of profound reflection, critical and self-critical reflection about the movement's experience, what went well, what went wrong, why didn't we achieve a Kurdish state through armed struggle, and should we achieve a Kurdish state through armed struggle? And essentially through interrogating the state itself and transforming their idea of what the goal was, what the political horizon was that they were marching towards, from a vision of a Kurdish socialist state, nation state, to a self-governed society, a pluralistically self-governed society for Kurdish people and for all the other diverse peoples who live in this historic homeland of Kurdistan. They had no choice but to then look inward and grapple with the question of internal organization and leadership, right? We're driving this truck that's designed to seize a state by force of arms. And now we decided our goal is to arrive somewhere else. So what do we do with this truck? Like, is it the right vehicle? Is it designed the right way? Do we need to change it? So if you read those sort of early prison writings of Abdullah Öcalan, he's grappling with this question intensely. He comes to a conclusion that the PKK, with its goal of seizing the state and achieving a state for Kurdistan, the party itself saw itself as an institution that would become the state. So the organization of revolutionaries was substituting itself for society as a whole. And he came to the conclusion that that was a profound mistake. Not only that that would not work strategically, but he reflected on how that, what they call state mentality, zinyeta dawlat, was turning in on itself and transforming the very personalities of the revolutionaries who were to carry out this revolution, right? He said it turned cadres into little despots, right? Little dictators. Because they sought not only to gain authority, but to become the authority. That was the paradigm of change. So again, how do we achieve these different ends if we have the same means? So the conclusion he came to was we have to build what he called a libertarian party of a new type. Libertarian in the tradition of libertarian socialism, of course, not in the tradition of this strange American monster that we call libertarianism for short sometimes. And in practice, the movement went through a structural transformation and an ideological transformation. The writings of Abdullah Öcalan were spread throughout the movement. There was a very messy series of conversations and conflicts. There were people who left the movement. This was not what I signed up for, right? And there were those who stayed. And there were a series of congresses through which the Kurdish movement transformed itself. And what happened, you could say, was that the party turned into a movement, right? There's still, on the other side, there was something called the PKK, but it wasn't really the same PKK anymore. It became what you could call a constellation of parties and social, civil society organizations, right? Because instead of creating this vehicle that's seeking itself to become the state, right? In Lenin's terms, to essentially carry out the revolution for the people, on behalf of the people, They would need to find a way for revolutionaries to make a revolution with the people, alongside the people. But crucially, they didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So the Kurdish movement also has its own version of this sort of popular anarchist myth that, and the Kurdish version goes like this. Abdullah Öcalan read Murray Bookchin, and then the Kurds became anarchists. First part's true. And Bookchin absolutely had a profound influence on the Kurdish movement through Öcalan. But the Bookchin that they were reading was communalist Bookchin. Bookchin himself, right, as Mason said, was also struggling with these questions, seeing the limitations of what could be achieved through purely, in his conception, through purely horizontalist, anarchistic means. So the movement did an interesting thing in practice. They created forms of social organization, meaning ways to organize society from the bottom up, right? Building self-governance, one block, one village at a time, bringing neighbors together. They combined that with a set of organizational principles, some of which they retained from the old tradition. They did not actually end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Some of that is because in real life, transformations are messy and the old always continues to exist alongside the new, right? So anybody who spent time around the Kurdish freedom movement could tell you that the old still exists alongside the new, and they're manifestations of, you know, what you could call the old paradigm that aren't necessarily this perfect higher synthesis. They're just kind of leftover Maoism stuff. And at the same time, it's not just all leftover. And the conclusion they came to in practice was that the organization of society and the organization of revolutionaries are two different things. Those are two different tasks those are two different questions of how that need to be answered in two different ways, right? Form follows function. So they knew, on the one hand, in order to create a self-governed society, a pluralistically self-governed society, they would have to build things like the communes and the councils and the cooperatives from the bottom up at the grassroots level. And those organizations would be effective and meaningful in moving towards self-governance to the extent to which they were democratic, because that's what they are, that's what they need to do. However, if you organize the revolutionaries along the same principle, the revolutionary organizations, plural, which came out of this paradigm shift, under the same principles as a neighborhood assembly, right? For example, anyone who walks through the door has an equal say. That revolutionary organization would start to lose its potency as a revolutionary catalyst, because it would be trying to do two different jobs at the same time. And in doing so, it would do a poorer job of each. So that differentiation was critical to find some higher synthesis in sort of dialectical language beyond this simple tension and contradiction between, do we, on the one hand, expect society to spontaneously empower itself if we just sprinkle in ideas to it? Or on the other hand, can we just will the revolution into being by sheer force of arms, right? The answer is no and a little bit of yes. It's messy, right? And taking either of these things to their ultimate conclusion too far in one direction will produce a set of problems that's irreconcilable and jeopardizes your ability to actually liberate society. So in practice, in Rojava, we can see things right now are in flux and in jeopardy. As painful as it is for accuracy and uncertainty, I'll talk about this a little bit in the past tense. But throughout the life of the autonomous administration of North and East Syria, the big fancy acronym for the autonomous zone and its structure of governance in Northeast Syria, Like we said earlier this week, they created these communes and councils from the neighborhood level, federating them up and up and up and up. And at least on paper, that's how you get to the autonomous administration of North and East Syria. Great, beautiful story, beautiful idea. Neighbors coming together, making decisions for themselves, and then electing and appointing delegates to move upward and outward to coordinate at a higher level. That's true. That was happening, but it didn't just happen, first of all. The only way that the space was created and seized and defended and the door of governance was held open for people in the communities to step into was that organizations of Kurdish revolutionaries, lifelong committed, trained, disciplined revolutionaries, took initiative, sacrificed their lives by the thousands to push out the state, to hold out ISIS and all other fascist forces trying to commit genocide against their people, and not just to end there. They didn't say the bad guys are gone, here's the keys, good luck, because self-governance. That doesn't work. They said the bad guys are gone, they're gone because we kicked them out, we have to hold them out, here's how you do it, here's how this works, here's how you govern and defend yourself and your own community. And that process was messy and dynamic. It happened unevenly throughout the entire life of the autonomous administration, right? There were the communes that existed in principle, the communes that existed in practice, right? You had assemblies that nobody came to, and you had assemblies that were functionally transcending state power. And it was all happening at once. And I think you could see how the viability of this revolutionary process was only made possible, especially at that scale, by having an understanding of the difference between the revolutionaries and the society at large. They're inseparable, but they're in relationship, right? And the goal was always to bring ordinary people into the fold, to help them build what the Kurdish movement calls revolutionary personality, this sense of taking a radical responsibility, not just for one's own individual life, but for one's community, for one's society, and dedicating oneself to the revolutionary cause. So the principle that you could kind of see playing out was that however contradictory, you had this democratic project, which was based on direct participation from the bottom up, and you saw that its survival and its growth and its existence in the first place was fundamentally predicated on the existence of leadership. And that leadership was actively trying to transcend the trappings of the old Leninist tradition, right, by not mandating the structures of governance into being. But they also were not sitting back and abdicating from responsibility under the delusion that a revolution would just make itself. No revolution is ever made without revolutionaries, and the Kurdish movement had a concept of what a revolutionary was. They still do. So when they created organizations in a more pluralistic way to transcend this sort of old paradigm of, what do you got behind me? Revolution takes revolutionaries. Hear, hear. When they created this plurality of parties and their civil society organizations in the Kurdish movement to try to move into the new paradigm, it took different forms. It meant there was a multiplicity of organizations. It meant that these organizations had more local autonomy. It meant that women, crucially, had higher levels of women's autonomy was taken to a new level, basically. It started before the paradigm shift. But it was taken kind of to its logical conclusion, where all the co-chairs of positions of responsibility were both men and women, where women created their own autonomous organizations, including autonomous all-women armed organizations, right? But these organizations themselves, as organizations, were not the whole answer. So the question was not just how do we build an organizational container for people who agree about politics to go out and participate in the world. I would argue that might be more the especivista approach. We need a bucket for the people with the shared politics and strategy, And their job is to be the people with those politics in our communities and hopefully influence those communities as much as possible. Kurdish movement took that further. Or more so, they retained the aspects from the Leninist tradition that served that function and took it further. And that is to look beyond just the organization to this messy term cadre. The word cadre just goes back to French. It means basically like a specialized trained group of traditionally soldiers. But in the Leninist tradition, the disciplined member of the political party is the cadre, right? One is a cadre of a revolutionary organization in that left tradition. So not only did the Kurdish movement retain the idea of political parties, even though Öcalan said we need to grapple with this question of how we create democratic political parties, libertarian parties, parties of a new type, parties that transcend the state mentality that is seeking to become the dominating power, and instead parties that see themselves as a catalyst for the revolutionary process itself. And those parties need committed, trained, disciplined, confident members. They call them cadres. So also, and this is a very messy question, which I will try to navigate skillfully, bear with me. But anyone who spent time in Rojava also understands that they're beyond the formal structures of self-governance, of self-administration, and all the pluralities of diverse civil society organizations. There exists a network of lifelong committed revolutionaries. These are people who literally have pledged their life to the cause of the revolution, and they say there's no turning back. These people have committed to never having children or a family or a romantic relationship, to never owning private property. I heard some internationalists refer to it as monks with guns. They don't have guns. But more colloquially, it's often just referred to as some Jedi shit. They don't all have guns. There's military structures, there's society structures, and there are lifelong committed revolutionaries in structures throughout society. But the revolution in Rojava would never have happened, it would never have survived, it would never have developed progressively in the direction of self-governance without a critical mass of committed, confident, capable revolutionaries who understood that as people who could see that society needed to be liberated, they had a special responsibility to see to it that it was liberated. And that didn't mean that they were a substitution for society itself. The people I'm referring to were not the people in the seat of government. They were a network of people who in every community were pushing ordinary folks to take active responsibility themselves as much as possible. To tell you a story, I once was invited to attend basically the equivalent of a city council meeting in the city of Tel Rifat. Tel Rifat is now occupied by Turkish-backed mercenaries after a brutal ethnic cleansing a couple years ago. But at the time I was there, it was governing itself through this project of democratic autonomy. And when I got this invitation, I thought, this is my chance to see what like a city government is like under democratic confederalism. And I went into a room basically like the same size as this, a little more jam-packed. Imagine this room at its fullest over the course of this week, and you have a couple of co-chairs in the front. One of them's a man, one of them's a woman. And you have a group of people out in the audience. All the people in the audience, they are delegates from every single neighborhood commune in the city. One man, one woman, the co-chairs. They're also delegates from every single citywide committee, which has its own neighborhood-based scale as well. I'm talking about things like women's committee, youth committee, culture committee, economy, defense, education, health. And that's the city government. right? And the idea is that these people are bringing with them reports from what is happening in their neighborhoods, the mandates from the people in their neighborhoods that they've received through their assemblies. And I expected, to just see, like on paper, this very clean, perfect process unfolding where everybody's giving their reports. And there were parts of that. It was incredibly inspiring. Honestly, even the things that were just mundane were emotionally moving because these were just ordinary people who were governing themselves functionally. But in the middle of that meeting, it kind of shifted from this more idyllic picture to a group of people who started getting petty, who started arguing with one another, who started making accusations of one another. That's where the Abdi stole extra bread from the commune fridge story comes from. Bless you, Abdi. I hope the friend does better work. And then what started to happen was commune co-chairs started to make excuses. The elected co-chairs of the council itself, of the city government, they said, we want the reports from the assemblies. And a couple of the commune co-chairs, representing their neighborhoods, they said, well, the people in my neighborhood, they don't care. So they don't come to the assembly. So why should I even try? I said, you didn't hold your monthly assembly? Well, they don't even come. So we're elected, we got co-chairs, it's fine, the trains are running on time. And these co-chairs are like, no. And the co-chairs, they try to give this speech and say, look, I think you're confused here. You're saying people in my neighborhood don't want to participate. The council should do something about this. The council should do something about that, right? They're bringing this state mentality. They're co-chairs of their neighborhood commune. They still think they're in a state. They're bringing their grievances. They're bitching at the city council. And so these co-chairs, bless them, the man and the woman, they've tried their best to say, look, but they're neighbors too. They're just members of this community, but they've been elected at the citywide level, kind of like a co-mayor, right? But it's more of a facilitator because less of an executive function. But you know what? The critique and the lesson, it kind of falls short. And at the end, the co-chair gets this look in his eye and he says, you know what? I'm going to call up a special speaker who's visiting here today. And the speaker says, we have a revolutionary here today, and we want to hear what she has to say. And I kind of had this sinking feeling in the back because a lot of people didn't know I was there. And sometimes people would change their behavior if an American or foreigner was there, try to make things look rosy. So I was excited because I'm going to see this warts and all, but then I was like, do I want to? Right? I really want this to be democratic. Am I about to see the shadow government of Rojava when this woman walks up to the front and lays down the line? So this young woman, confident, floral scarf, walks up the front. She's got a smirk on her face, this ain't my first rodeo. She gets to the front and she says, well, I guess you all need to see some more education here, don't you? And my heart sinks. I'm like, that's it. The autonomous administration isn't real. She's the government. She's laying down a party line. And then she finishes her sentence. And she says, more or less, because you keep coming to me asking me what to do. You think I'm going to solve your problems. You think the council's going to solve your problems. You should all see yourselves as cadre of building this new society, she said. And I'll never forget that. And so here I am in the middle of this intense contradiction, right? This community is in a process of learning to govern itself, but it can't do it without leadership. The leader is saying lead yourselves, but it took a leader to say that, and it took a leader to be listened to hear that lesson. And however contradictory or paradoxical that may seem, that's how this real living, breathing revolution unfolded in practice. And I think it's probably a first principle to understand. So I went on and on and on with the story. We should probably wrap up or move on. But it's a tension. It's inescapable.
Should we...
I have no idea where we're at anymore. I just let her rip. Sorry.
Okay. Well, let's just move to some conclusion here. The Kurdish freedom movement underwent a profound self-transformation as a result of concluding that its own ideas and its own movement culture was an impediment to its goals. And even that its apparent goals were impediments to its vision. You know, this is where David Cobb's differentiation here is really helpful. The vision is freedom for Kurdish people. They thought the goal was seizing a state. And along the way, they developed a set of practices and ideas that kept them from achieving their higher vision. We would argue that at least for those of us who were politicized in the wake of the Zapatista uprising, or the Battle of Seattle, or Occupy Wall Street, or Black Lives Matter, whose primary experience has been of bottom-up, horizontal, protest-oriented movements, that we suffer from something the same, even if it is completely inverted. We have big, beautiful ideas of where we want to go. And the kinds of practices and organizational forms that prevail in our movement are not the vehicles that are going to take us there. And so we just want to round this out with some thinking about what we would like to see as a new paradigm for movements from below in this country, or of revolutionaries who want to rethink their relationship to those movements from below. So for our old paradigm, and this may not make sense to all of you. I think it will be very familiar to those of you who are coming from an anarchist or libertarian socialist perspective. What we look to are these leaderless, spontaneous uprisings, and have a sort of movement allergy to structured forms of organization, to leadership, to discipline, to anything that smells of an imposed theoretical and tactical unity. You see these things as threats that are merging in our movement that will try to make us more like state-oriented parties. The new paradigm is something we have to shape together, and it would be silly for us to announce it, declare it as such. The reason why there is
I proclaim a new paradigm.
The reason why there's a new paradigm in the Kurdish movement is because they wrestled with this for years. They had real political organizations that debated each other, and it was painful. And it shattered relationships that had been part of struggle for decades. But they came out the other side with a kind of foundational, conceptual unity of what they were doing and how. And we can talk more in discussion about how concretely that looks, but just summarize simply as we close out. We think this requires a conception of a movement ecology, where there are different organizations playing different roles in this larger process. Some of those are what we might call mass organizations, the assemblies, the co-ops, the communes, these participatory open bodies that are going to be the real governing force of the future society, and they will be the institutions through which revolutionary popular energy is channeled. But those are not going to drop from the sky. They don't just happen when a spontaneous protest kicks off, although weak and embryonic forms might show their faces during those moments. We think this process requires dedicated organizations of people with a clear revolutionary politics who are following a shared program of building radical democracy from below. Those are ideologically grounded organizations that have unity of their theory and their tactics. And they task themselves with developing a strategy for getting from here to there, and in leading the formation of these mass organizations, playing a role of catalyzing within them to inject them with radical energy. We've already talked about this. But part of what we're discussing today is rethinking as individuals what our role in this struggle is. And maybe the world that we want to see, or the society we're trying to build, is one in which everyone feels free to do whatever they like, come and go as the inspiration moves them. But becoming a revolutionary requires shouldering a qualitatively different kind of responsibility and commitment. And it entails forms of organization that don't look exactly like the assemblies and the cooperatives that are the world that we're making. And this, in essence, this what's called organizational dualism of organizations of revolutionaries building organizations of the people and fighting within them for a free society, is what we're trying to gesture towards as what we hope will become a new paradigm here in this country. And I think we can shift to some discussion from there.
Good to go? Please.
Yeah, I guess I had a bit of a sort of clarifying question with the mass organization cadre divide. So if I'm understanding correctly, the idea is that the mass organizations is really where the direct democracy happens, right? That is the governing body, and therefore the cadre organizations are sort of more higher level vision, guidance type thing, but they wouldn't say hold any title or be representative of any specific constituency, or they wouldn't hold an office if we're using sort of relative terms to a state model. Is that right?
That's certainly true in Rojava. But in more general terms, I think what we're just trying to outline is that there's a difference between the institutions we need to build to empower our communities to learn to govern themselves, and the organizations we need to form as revolutionaries who see the need to catalyze a revolutionary process. And those two different functions will probably require two different forms. We're not trying to be prescriptive about it, but just to give the most simple example of a distinction, right? A political organization, at minimum, if it's coherent, is only open to people who have a shared alignment with the political platform of the political organization.
Right.
You can't do that with the community assembly.
Right.
That's not its job. That sacrifices its function as a vehicle for self-governance.
Right.
But are you going to bring those organizations into existence? Are you going to help your neighbors as effectively as possible learn how to self-govern? Are you going to influence the political content that comes into those spaces of direct democracy and make it liberatory? Are we going to challenge our neighbors to think about what a free life means without having spaces where we can talk about that with one another, develop ideas, distill strategies, and commit ourselves to them, and make ourselves accountable to each other and to those ideas, right? So it's simply the idea that I'll paraphrase Grace Lee Boggs. I think she once said something like, you can have a rebellion without revolutionaries, but you can't have a revolution without revolutionaries. In other words, a rebellion can happen spontaneously. You don't need any clever group of people for a rebellion to take place. Most rebellions take place on their own. Uprisings, popular explosions of indignation. 2020 was that. But if we want to be able to harness that energy in an intentional direction to create lasting transformation, we won't be able to do it without organizations with a coherent set of politics. That's what we're offering. Yeah.
To your question of do cadre or cadre organizations have positions in the mass organization, I just want to share some examples in which they totally would. So let's think about a labor union. A union is a mass organization, at least in relation to the people who work in a workplace. Includes everybody. If your goal as a militant minority within that labor union and perhaps part of a larger political organization that's trying to seek a foothold there, your goal is for them to seize control of that workplace. It very well may make sense to get some of your core members on leadership bodies in that union, to take up a position of leadership or a platform from which to agitate your fellow workers towards that kind of end. You would not enshrine the ideological organization as, you know, some kind of leading appendage on top of it, but we need to be inserting individual cadre into these like strategic points in the broader movement ecosystem to be able to cohere them strategically as part of the bigger vision of transforming things.
Yeah, we can just add a little bit to what Comrade Arthur was talking about with rebellion versus revolution. I think it's a really interesting example because we were earlier talking about the Arab Spring, or some people say, because it wasn't just Arabs, the Spring of Peoples. Most of those rebellions, those uprisings, they resulted in like a change, but then it kind of reverted back to an authoritarianism, didn't create like the desired result. The one place where there was revolutionary leadership, decades-long organization, a cadre organization, we can say like defined revolutionary leadership with clear principles, was in the Kurdish areas of north and east Syria, as far as the countries that participated in the Arab Spring. And we see now also the Kurdish freedom movement has withdrew from the areas that didn't have that decades-long organization and presence of revolutionary leadership. So I just wanted to supplement it. You can really see is like an organization, like a cadre organization, having a real, like, meaningful impact on a revolutionary situation.
Thanks so much for adding it. To add small little tidbit, many people aren't familiar with it, but during the Syrian Revolution, there also was an anarchist movement in the southwest, inspired by the ideas of someone named Omar Aziz. And the main thrust of this movement was to create what they call local councils. Some ways really parallel to this idea of democratic confederalism, right? But that movement did not have what the friend was outlining here, of the presence of organized discipline, leadership, and a coherent program, and the ability to defend themselves. And they essentially all became repressed out of existence or co-opted by various other political forces. So it's interesting kind of A-B at the same time in the same country.
I want to put a question from online that I think is interesting. Liza asked how this is different from vanguardism and is concerned about differentiating between revolutionary and non-revolutionary as blocking the pathway for organic revolutionaries to be formed. Should we take a few questions? Or?
Yeah.
Thank you both for the presentation. I'm thinking in sort of on a different vein. When facilitating a small meeting or a participatory assembly, it's often best that the facilitators don't participate themselves. And then I'm thinking of militant PKK being called the Jedi and like not also participating in daily cultural life. And just wondering what our thoughts are on that.
I think my question is very similar, just about the culture within a cadre organization. I've heard a story recently about Ochelan's cadre living together in the same apartment, sharing food, sharing jackets. There are like kind of legends sometimes about these, but I'm really curious in the Kurdish movement and maybe at a higher abstraction, like how do you see cadre organizations culturally, socially working within themselves, if that makes sense?
How many should we take before? Should we take a track at a few? Okay.
I think you can combine them with
Yep.
local cadre.
Yeah. So first, about the question of like whether the existence of an explicit revolutionary minority does or could block the development of organic revolutionaries. I think that it can if it's done poorly, and we've seen more examples of it done poorly than done well, frankly. But I see the Kurdish freedom movement as a movement that is struggling through practice to answer this question and find a new way. And what I don't want to portray this story as like a squeaky clean, they found the perfect synthesis and, khalas, as they say, like that's it, story over. The truth is that this is still very messy process with bumps along the road. In some ways, I think we can even merge this with the question of whether Kurdish revolutionaries participate in the life of society and how they do, whether they have their own ways of participating with one another communally and what that produces. And so I'll just kind of mush this together to try to paint a picture of some of the problems and contradictions that this situation creates. So for example, yes, the existence of a militant minority, a group of explicitly committed revolutionaries, has been indispensable to the process of building and defending the Rojava Revolution from the very beginning. And also, you see examples of how the gap of consciousness, the gap of culture, the gap of just lived experience between committed revolutionaries and ordinary people in the communities creates its own set of problems often, right? So, for example, I once met a woman who was a lifelong committed revolutionary who I was told spent a lot of time in the mountains, and I heard her say out loud that she assumed that an iPhone cost $15. And could somebody help her get one? She had no idea how much an iPhone costs, and that might sound like a silly thing. It kind of is. But what does that say about the ability of a revolutionary to relate to the people that she sees herself as responsible for helping liberate, right? If you can't relate to the everyday struggles of your people, then that's going to create a whole new set of problems and contradictions. And you could see this play out in all kinds of different ways, including ways that the intensity of commitment and ideological fervor of some of these revolutionaries itself could be alienating sometimes. You could see a problem reproduce itself. I once was pulled aside by this villager in a farmers union meeting in northern Aleppo, and he said, "Hey, you're not from here, right?" I was like, "You got me." And he's like, "You think you could like talk to the revolutionaries, to the comrades, to like send some of the comrades to my village?" And I'm like, why do you think I can do that for you? He's kind of assuming you're American, you could pull some strings, right? And I was asking him, like, what do you mean? He's like, well, the people in my village, they just don't get it. Like, they don't even know who Abdullah Öcalan is. They don't know what democratic confederalism is. Like, they don't understand that we're in the middle of a revolution, so they don't participate. They need education. And I was kind of like, well, you seem to get it. Like, can't that be done through the communes? And he's like, well, what is a commune if the people don't even understand that they're in a revolution, right? And I said, well, surely the role of education in the community is not just that of the comrades, the committed revolutionaries around here. They can't be everywhere. Can you talk to your neighbors? And he just said a simple sentence that I'll never forget. He said, when they speak, the people listen, right? And that was true, and that was important. I thought back to that meeting, right? When this revolutionary, she was like telling people, you need to take responsibility for yourselves in your own community because nobody else can do it for you. That's what self-governance is. But, however, you could see in this example of the farmer that the existence of that difference, the existence of that gap, reproduced the problem too. It was because they had all this reverence that they're like, well, what do I know? I need to get the comrades to come. So it's very messy.
Yes, well, first, thank you both for your presentation. You've helped me with something that I've been trying to struggle with, and that is, I've been hearing that a lot of former anarchists are now Marxist-Leninists, and I wasn't tracking that, and I was not sure why, so thank you for that framing about this piece about the more militant folks, right? Like, we don't really have a place for that. And you've made me recall a couple of things, and one of them is like with Subcomandante Marcos, he has become deceased, and that happened in 2014, because as a tactic, right, as the spokesperson that could allow the world to see them, it worked until it didn't work, because then people were starting to do the cult of personality that he is the Zapatista. So I was really happy when they transitioned him out, because that was the big contradiction that I had when I would talk about the Zapatistas, that they're an assembly and they're popular, but then there's this huge towering figure of Marcos, right?
Yeah.
And it speaks a lot about how they do a lot of self-critique constantly, and they allow that space. In a lot of spaces I've been in, sadly, that have been inspired by the Zapatistas, are inspired by Marcos. They're inspired, and especially Chicanos, like he's like that, that bridge, and then they kind of adopt the cult of personality thing, and then you can't critique anything that happens, any ethical questions, or you become the bad guy because you're trying to take down the whole movement now, and that sort of thing. So we need to have space for critique, right?
Yeah.
Auto-critique. That so much so that they have disbanded their entire juntas de buen gobierno. They no longer exist. The good government councils no longer exist, and it's more down at the base, at the local level.
Right.
And there's a really beautiful communique that Marcos read as he was becoming deceased on stage. It's called Between Light and Shadow, and it talks about this transition, right, where at first they did need a very strong presence, right? And then they worked toward not needing that presence anymore. And I feel like if we're working toward like long-term, like generational, rather than just like immediate kind of visions, that can help. Like, how can the ones that are militant make themselves no longer needed, right? Rather than congealed into this cult of personality. And also with the assembly and the strategy and tactics, I'm going to be thinking a lot about what you've put forward, because when I think about like how we might be able to get away from.
Will those? So keep the mic and speak, and I think regardless of whether it's coming out in the room, the remote folks can hear us.
So when I think about like this issue, I'm a big believer that we can get to a point where the assembly does the strategy and the leadership does the tactics, right? And so then that allows everybody to participate in the huge question of strategy with vision, goals, and everything. But not everybody has the time, the capacity, right, for this. And the tactics have to be guided by the strategy, right? And so I think that gets us away from like the problems that I've been a part of, is just hoping everything is going to work out and everyone's going to do great, and there's no leadership, right? So we still need the leadership. And then I'll just wrap up with the Jedi question, because as you were speaking, I was totally thinking about the Jedis. Because I think about Anakin a lot. Anakin fell in love, right? And he was not supposed to fall in love, right? And so then what happens? Like, he is not well. He becomes Darth Vader, right? So like, we're asking people to not be fully human, right? And to not be guided by love, instead to be machines, right? For this struggle. And is that really tenable, right? And does that create a massive disconnection to love and to community, right? So thank you for that, because I am a big Star Wars nerd also.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, thank you for the conversation. It really bookended the beginning of this week. And my question is also about the Jedis in a different...
What have I done? I'm gonna have to send a self-criticism somewhere.
in a different regard, and from the context I'm coming from at a local level, we have a number of like super badass folks that are doing some good work and such, but through history, through interpersonal conflict, through trauma, through various things, they've basically isolated. They've become their own island. They've basically were like, well, I used to work with those folks, but not anymore. I'm just on my own now. And so instead of my question asking, how do we activate class consciousness with, people that aren't militant in that regard, how do we bring back in the fold and have healing with the people who have felt disenfranchised, disenchanted, disillusioned about the movement and are suffering trauma?
How do you want to handle wrapping up? So we're at, it's already.
Maybe you go and then you go and then we can.
And we'll wrap it up.
Word.
We're running out of time, y'all. Sorry, it's a good problem, but thank you.
Yeah. I really, really appreciated this talk. I just want to say thank you both. I thought this was really well researched and well put forward, and I'm very grateful for it. I just want to share a couple reflections and like a response to some of the things said. But two things that I really liked about this is like embracing different phases also of a revolution, that like there are going to be different phases of all of our collective development, and I think this lays out really well that like you have to know your conditions and where the people are at, create goals and strategies for that, and that can change and transform, and that like our movements should be embracing flexibility, agility, and change based on the conditions and the people. And I really also just appreciate you kind of addressing the elephant, at least in my head, which is like the anarchism, Marxism, schisms that we're repeating constantly on the left and creating a lot of conflict, in my opinion, unnecessary conflict, because I think we all want mostly the same thing, but to resist dogma and black and white thinking in this. And I think the examples that we go through, like Roosevelt and Zapatistas, do a really good job of, they specifically say we're not this, we're doing something in between or in the gray area, and that's good. And then lastly, I just really want to emphasize, I think, the importance of our own education. Obviously, this presentation is amazing because of it's grounded in revolutionary history. And I really encourage folks in the room to study revolutionary history beyond Roosevelt and the Zapatistas. There's so much to learn, and we've been really propagandized to fear names like Mao, and I think it's really important that we actually put aside some of that and read and learn and study and critique everything. But I just really, really appreciated how grounded in revolutionary history this is, and that we have to learn from mistakes in the past and successes of the past. And if these names were not like unknown, like really, it's so awesome to learn this stuff. Y'all should really embrace it. Lastly, to respond to Kiki,
Preach.
I thought a great example for you around like, do revolutionaries need to make this inhuman sacrifice? There's some great work by Assata Shakur, a black revolutionary. I'm sure you've read it. But just there's a great essay she writes about deciding to have a romantic relationship and have a baby. That as she is also coming into and becoming a revolutionary. And so it's just another opinion in our context of another way of thinking about what does it mean to become a revolutionary and to embrace life, birth, and love in that. So just offering that for people to look into it.
Good and try to capture those answers.
I don't have much to add. I think you both like shared. I couldn't say it better myself. You had a last question, Graham?
Yeah, it's just, I think, so there's been a significant amount of literature lately, I mean, literature is a word, about self-care, about joy being the thing that we should be striving for as like the primary activating force towards resistance and revolution. And you've talked about all these folks that seem like there's a level of discipline that maybe is missing in the United States context. And I just feel like this sounds like a lot of work. So can you tell us why we shouldn't just like focus solely on joy? I'm gonna get it later.
Yeah.
You celebrate when you win the Super Bowl.
Beyond self-care. I think the best answer I can try to come up with is when we really interrogate this question of self-care, I want to challenge us all to interrogate the word self. Who is the self that we're caring for? I think in many ways, the Kurdish revolutionaries I met who changed my life and inspired me seem to embody an expansive sense of self, an inspiring lack of separation and differentiation between themselves and their communities, their people, their neighbors, their society. And on the one hand, I think that those who have dedicated their lives to revolution, which by the way is not just people who swore off families and relationships, property. They were also what I would call everyday revolutionaries who embodied this kind of revolutionary personality, as they say. But my biggest takeaway and lasting impression from those who embody this kind of revolutionary selfhood was just that. Was that on the one hand, they did make hard choices. Many, many, many people had to make hard choices and sacrifices. And in a certain way, there were sacrifices of parts of their humanity. There were parts of the potential life that lived within them, paths that they could have taken, right? That they had to choose not to take another path. And I'm certainly not here to say I know what is the correct path for you and you and you and you. Those are deeply personal decisions. But I will say is that when the real deal walked into the room and you could spend time with somebody who really committed their life to a revolution, you were not just spending time with a person who had a reduced sense of self, who had dehumanized themselves in order to, throw their body on the machine, so to speak. There's an element of that. There's an element of sacrifice. Often, it felt like being around people who experienced more joy than anybody else I'd ever met. People who had that smirk on their face, who had a sense of humor. It was almost as if they knew the punchline to a joke that you couldn't really be told unless you directly experienced it yourself, which was that freedom is possible. And when you step into a life that's dedicated to the realization of humanity's potential as a whole, it is liberating, spiritually liberating. Now, I'm not saying I've achieved that within myself. I was inspired by that. Certainly a North Star that I'd love to strive towards. But I think, I'd love to just end it in a way that's not about personal judgment, but it is just about asking ourselves and each other the simple question of what is the purpose of our lives? We're in this moment where we're moving into some very scary possibilities. But the coming crisis and the crisis that's already here, it doesn't bring just threats, right? It always brings opportunities. And I personally believe that includes opportunities for a profound transformation of society itself in the years to come. And I would aspire to and would love to be on a journey with all of you to figuring out how we answer that question for ourselves of who we are, how we define ourselves, how we define our responsibilities, so that we can figure out how to wade through these messy questions and liberate our communities. So,
couple quick thoughts.
Yeah.
I want to reply with.
American society where even if you're in political spaces, you don't necessarily have community. So if you want individuals to go beyond the self, we actually have to cultivate this sense of community, even within political spaces.
Right.
Because you have to have that sense of care when you go out to your political spaces. That you describe that inside joke, right? The ability to not all political spaces have that, right?
Totally. Right. So for those at home, the friend here is raising a really important point. which is that, that decision to dedicate your life, it can't just happen in a vacuum. And in Kurdistan, for example, people are in a context, in a society, in a culture where there is a larger, and I apologize if I'm sort of not doing justice to what you're saying, that can actually materially and spiritually hold you as an individual stepping into that life, stepping into a revolutionary life. So here we have to figure out not just how to make these decisions as individuals, but how to sort of build the collective infrastructure, if you will, and culture that can actually hold us on that journey and move forward together. I hope that does justice for the listeners remotely.
Yeah, and Sirisha kind of voiced what I was about to respond with as well. I think, I'll just start by saying, obviously, I'm not trying to make the case that we should replicate the organizational culture of the Kurdish freedom movement as far as like what is asked of revolutionaries, as far as like what are their lives they cut themselves off from. I don't know if any of you have met a small person this week named Rosie, but clearly, I think we live in a very different cultural context, and it's important to think about the ways in which the role of women in the struggle was concretely facilitated by this ban on relationships for those who go off into the mountains. It's a very different landscape that they're navigating. But what I want to say to this broader question of what makes it possible for a person to commit themselves, I just want to share that if you've met someone other than Rosie this week who lives in Bellingham, each and every one of those people are a member of an organization built along these lines. And I think the flip side of interrogating the self in self-care is not just thinking about who is the self getting cared for, but who is the self doing the caring. And the thing that and I would love if in follow-up conversations people can correct me on this point, but I think we are all in very solid agreement here that the thing that has allowed us to commit ourselves on this much deeper level than we have ever done in prior movement organizations is precisely because internally we have crafted this culture of care for one another, of relationship, of a human bond that anchors us in this lifelong project. And that is in my view, like the central element of what it means to create movements and organizations that can ask more of us. It's not a vacuum of the individual who vacates the self in order to give themselves to the struggle. We have to have struggles that sustain us through them. And I think both the Zapatistas and the Kurdish freedom movement are some of the most powerful examples of it, but there are such concrete ways in which we can build that into our own organizations that are, less far along in their development. And I hope we can wrestle together with what that looks like here in this country.
One last important point I want to emphasize, and we can go, I promise, is it's crucial. It's something that Kiki brought up is self-criticism and evolution, right? If we're describing what is needed in broad terms as something like a movement ecology, one which embraces and navigates differentiation within a larger whole, all ecologies evolve, right? There's no such thing as a static ecosystem. And that means that there's no one or permanent answer to these questions. So what we need to do is not, right, like go home and found an organization that's got the perfect structure and bylaws, right? I think what we're trying to invite everybody to kind of step into with us is to move forward together and feel challenged by this question of how are we going to navigate these tensions together consciously and intentionally, acknowledging that they are there. And even in the Kurdish movement, you see this movement evolving. This is a movement that would have never gone through a paradigm shift if it was not for its practice of what it calls criticism or self-criticism, tekmil. And even today, the Kurdish movement is going through yet another transformation, and none of us know what it's going to look like on the other side. Öcalan himself, who very much, I mean, if there's a cult of personality around Subcomandante Marcos, there's certainly been a cult of personality around Abdullah Öcalan. They call him uncle, they call him leader, right? In the past, he's I think, done things to perpetuate that cult of personality. He has also criticized that cult of personality, especially recently. So movements that are actually figuring out how to navigate this are movements in motion, in the very basic definition of a movement itself. So I encourage us all to think about this as a set of principles and practices and tensions that we can navigate consciously, not as prescriptive answers to what to go do.